you can't call your comic publisher bad ink and not do at least some of Inktober. Lydia sent me this footage and said, "I'm trying to do some of Inktober. Sorry the first one is so sketchy and rushed." But when I watched it, my mind was blown, because I never really thought of India ink as a medium you can sketch with. But here it is. It's like a charcoal gestural drawing, but it's India ink. And even though every line is permanent, there's a looseness to the way Lydia is working here. She's finding the forms through multiple passes of quick gestural lines. So today's Inktober takeaway is that if you want to get better at analog inking, you have to practice using it in a variety of ways. And it doesn't always have to be the immaculate, smooth lines that go over polished pencils. The biggest mistake you can make when you first try analog inking is to treat it like calligraphy. Now, let's say you're ink curious. You go to an art store, find a nib that flexes like crazy, then you take it home and load it up with ink, and you try and do every line in one smooth, elegant stroke from start to finish with zero jitter. And you start getting frustrated because you realize that sign painters and calligraphy artists practice for decades just to be able to do that. But here, you can see Lydia, who is truly a master of comic inking, taking advantage of line weight changes by varying the pressure, but also building up larger lines with smaller ones. Not getting too obsessed with pure calligraphy style technique, sometimes with smaller, sketchier lines and sometimes with larger lines, but she's really letting the art flow naturally as her mind finds the forms. Analog inking is classic, super old school inking. India ink bottles and dip pens and brushes. Sort of like how people who are really into collecting records talk about the richness of analog sound. No hate at all to digital inkers though. And honestly, there are some shockingly good digital brushes that simulate what Lydia's doing here. But man, there's something untouchable about the texture and character you can get from a real brush on paper, especially when you're rendering a material like leather. The texture feels so natural when you let the ink start to purposely dry out a little bit on the bristles, and it starts laying down rough passes with each brush stroke. It's such a gritty, meaty texture on the page, you almost want to hold the drawing up to your nose to see if it actually smells like leather too. If you needed another reason to try dip pen inking versus, say, marker, fine liner, or brush pen, then just watch the flexibility as Lydia draws this Mike Mignola-esque demon tree. Literally, look at how flexible a dip pen nib can be. If you really press hard, the amount of variation can be crazy, giving you wedge-shaped marks you'd normally see from a brush pen. But then, without changing implements, Lydia can also go in and lightly add fine details in the back, equivalent to the delicate control of a fine liner. In fact, if you watch the rest of this drawing come to life, you'll realize that the entire thing was done with one nib in one shot. And that's the real power of the old school techniques. You're watching brush inking on what's called Vellum Surface Bristol board, which is basically the fancy art name for thick paper that's a little pulpy, not perfectly smooth. The texture of the paper means that every line, even if you have incredibly smooth technique, always has some amount of texture built in. Which means that when you render an object that has a lot of texture, like the black plastic of a pair of binoculars, the rough areas of your drawing feel cohesive with the smooth line work. It's like an analog grunge filter built into the physical materials, and it develops as you work. And it's that interplay between smooth and rough that's so engaging to watch. The cool thing about working with liquid ink is that you can add water and essentially get an entirely new medium, ink wash, which is a lot like watercolor, but also sort of not. See, high shellac ink is technically called waterproof ink, which means that the line art that Lydia has already laid down is protected from the wet ink washes over top. But it's not entirely waterproof. Working quickly, she can also go back over the wet parts with dark washes and let it all bleed together, creating an organic, painterly effect that feels like highly opaque watercolor. And if you're thinking, wait, there's too much black, then just watch the drying process sped up 10 times, because ink wash is a devious trickster that's never done confusing you. I don't know about that, but I do know that your comment made us think of the movie Master and Commander, so here's Lydia working on an old school sailing vessel. Now, this highlights the importance of using good reference. In this case, a quick search for old documents and engravings ensure that your drawing will be historically accurate. As a viewer, even if you're not an expert in old sailing vessels, you feel extra engaged when you come across a drawing with this much consideration behind it. In our latest comic, Lydia drew a similar ship in even more detail, just to make the scene feel extra immersive to readers. And when you can draw like this, you do sometimes lean back, look at your page, and say,
I am the Master Commander.
If you're new to drawing, you struggle to draw things how you see them. If you're experienced, you draw everything accurately. If you're a seasoned pro, you're so good you can intentionally distort and simplify things in ways that create better characters. And that's exactly what Lydia is doing here, using cartoonish simplification and perspective distortion to take this drawing from merely cute to ultra engaging, whimsical, and charming. Ultimately, that's the true mastery of cartooning as an art form. Being able to shrink a back leg or render a mountain with a handful of elegantly placed lines, that's a cartoonist's brain in flow state. Not overworking details or obsessing over realism, but thinking about the emotional impact of a drawing and how to get there playfully.
The scariest thing you can do with ink is to place a fully loaded dip pen on a completely blank page. No pencils, no guidelines. But if you can power through the nerves, you'll discover that you work completely differently. You become focused on finding forms in the moment, and all of a sudden, you're experimenting with different line weights and different types of marks, stacking concentric horizontal lines to find a vertical shape, or even finding the light and dark parts of a light source by building it up gradually. And once you've found your forms, you can switch to a brush and begin to do more traditional comic inking, pushing shadows and adding depth. So, in a way, you did pencil your drawing. You just used ink as the pencils. You've seen us talk about smooth inking styles and sketchier inking styles, but what about being so good at both styles that you can combine them in one drawing? When you're able to switch effortlessly, you enter inking flow state, where you automatically adjust the motion of your arm and the pressure of your hand to fit the shape, texture, or material you're trying to convey in every single part of a drawing. Sketchy lines for a wispy fabric or bristling animal hair. Smooth, confident curves for muscles and bone. Thick lines and thick to thin lines. And maybe, just as a final flex, some rough splatters to show you have fully conquered your fear of unpredictable liquid. 99% of the posts you'll see during Inktober are black and white, but this is Kuretake Vermilion ink, which is technically a calligraphy ink, so it's all very illegal. But I won't tell if you don't. The magic of pigmented ink is that it still gives you those classic, bold comic book lines. But you can still play with semi-transparent shading by using dry brushing, so it adds depth and dimension to your forms. And then, at the end, you can go in with carefully placed lines in traditional black ink, which instantly add definition and contrast. And the final result, with its clever use of limited palette, negative space, and composition, well, it almost feels more like a piece of clever graphic design, rather than a quick sketch by a pen and ink illustrator. Here's a landscape that's about 85% done. And while it's quite a striking concept piece, fitting for a world created by Tolkien or Herbert, watch how much comes together in the final 15%, when Lydia switches to a brush and adds a final pass of shadows. This is exactly why you sometimes hear us say, push the shadows. Because while it can be intimidating to go back over line work you're already happy with, ink is a medium that works best when you use it without fear. And a final shadow pass is the difference between flat and alive. You've seen inking with no pencils, but what about chaos theory inking? When you don't even know what you're drawing yet. You just tilt your desk at a high angle, take some liquid ink wash, and just let it drip down the page. Then load up the brush with pure black ink and tap the wet parts and watch it spread into further chaos. And then take stock of the forms that are taking shape and say, okay, I guess I can work with this. And before you know it, you've gone from Jeff Goldblum dripping random water droplets down the back of a hand to something that looks like a Ridley Scott concept piece from the late 70s. If you watch our videos and go, man, this guy really thinks highly of his own drawing skills, what an arrogant f***, then I have to once again remind you that I'm not the one drawing. Lydia sends me footage, I watch it, and think of a lesson or a moment that you can learn something from. Actually, one is happening right now. It's the moment Lydia does the cross-hatching on this specific part of the bike. Just one tiny moment. But that's what makes it so interesting to me. Those kinds of small decisions keep the entire piece feeling engaging when you look at it. And being able to notice and appreciate those techniques when you look at others' art, well, that's how you keep your brain active and learning, even when you aren't actively making art of your own. Someone commented saying they'd buy all of our comics if we did a Western-style drawing, to which I had to clarify, Western as in non-manga or Western as in cowboys and six-shooters. And they said no, gunslingers, shootouts, bar fights, that kind of thing. Gunslinger, eh? Well, we can figure something out, even though it looks like Lydia's already drawing a grunge-style guitar player. But maybe we can sneak something in there, because we really want you to check out our comics if you can. Thank you, Sai. Everyone seemed to like our grunge guitar player with a gunslinger poster, but what about a gunslinger grunge guitar player? Which is also a great opportunity to talk about mixing textures in your shading. Lydia is rendering the slouchy stripes in that iconic Cobain sweater with rough vertical lines and zigzags, creating the sense of rough wool or cashmere. The hat brim uses rough lines that conform to the curves of the hat shape, creating the sense that it's a firmer material. The shadows cast by his boots on the ground use feathered, semi-dry brushing lines, creating the sense that he's standing on hard-packed dirt. But all of these shading techniques are similar in that they could be described by today's Inktober prompt: grungy. This drawing looks finished, but is it really? Could you stop here, scan it, and use a program to add snakeskin and leather texture and extra shading? Yeah, this is where I'd stop and continue in digital. But I've always respected that Lydia pushes her line art so much further than I would. I'm always too afraid that adding more lines and shading means muddier line art. And that is the confidence we always talk about building in pen and paper inking. Committing. Knowing how to push the ink just far enough that it never becomes overworked, but pushing past your comfort zone and adding enough that when you do finally finish and scan it, it has that extra personality imbued in its DNA. The hardest part of being a working comic artist? You cannot be bad at drawing something. You have to be able to draw everything. A lot of aspiring comic artists practice anatomy, faces, and costumes, but if a writer hands you a script that calls for a restored Cadillac, you can't tell them, oh, I don't draw cars very well. You have to be able to draw the best Cadillac you possibly can draw, because nothing is worse than reading a comic where almost everything looks good. So the best advice you'll ever get? Train your eyes and brain to translate any reference photo of a person, place, or thing into your own style. The most common question we get now is, you've made me want to learn traditional inking, but how do I get better at it? How do I even practice? And I know this sounds like a weird non-answer, but don't just practice inking. Practice all types of traditional art. Lydia and I grew up together taking painting classes in middle school and high school, and to this day, I still see her use lessons we learned in oil and acrylic and watercolor. And the reason she's so good at inking comics is that she thinks like an artist, and not just a comic artist. Sometimes we mistakenly think that the only reason to practice drawing is to get finer and finer lines, that the crowning achievement in all of comics is hyper-detailed cross-hatching. But that's only one expression of inking skill. And the cool thing about working with India ink is that you pair it with a watercolor brush. And watercolor brushes don't have to be 00 fineliners. They come in much larger sizes too, which means that when you're rendering something like the flowing currents of a deep ocean trench, you can intentionally relax, work loosely, and create huge expressive curves that match the terrifyingly massive currents of the ocean. There's a misconception that brush inking isn't good for mechanical devices or objects that rely on straight lines and geometric shapes. But with enough skill, brushwork is actually an incredible way to render machines and vehicles. Just look at how Lydia handles this rhino on a motorcycle. Obviously a rhino, with its rough skin and blubbery muscular form, is perfect for brushwork. But the inking on the bike retains that same grungy line quality, which helps unify the entire drawing. This is a great way to avoid that look you see too often in modern comics, where organic characters clash with overly clean mechanical environments and equipment. It's why we always call brushwork an analog grunge filter, because it almost feels like a uniting filter that you can apply to your entire drawing. So it turns out when you go viral for a comic inking video, you also get a ton of people asking what kind of pen you use. Now in most of our videos, Lydia is using a Tachikawa pen holder and nib. The holder is usually under $10, and you can find a 3-pack of nibs for under $5, which is actually quite affordable, especially considering Lydia has used this exact pen for hundreds and hundreds of hours by now. In fact, dip pen is probably the most economical way to ink. The trade-off, of course, is that it's particularly hard to master, and those hundreds of hours have led to this drawing, where every single line is one perfect controlled motion with perfect thick-to-thin taper. And the final result is a timeless portrait that looks like it could have run in the Saturday Evening Post a century ago. Well, except they wouldn't know who Pee-wee is. A lot of people have heard the advice, don't go too far, you don't want your drawing to get overworked. But I hate that this is considered a general rule, especially when you work in ink-on-paper comic art, because it's already natural to be fearful of such an unforgiving medium, and if we can lie to ourselves with, well, I don't want to go too far, then we can justify stopping too early. But ink tends to work better when you push the shadows and push the contrast. And when your subject matter is the rotting effluence of a demonic skeletal warrior, well, load up on those lines. Push the dark areas. Go too far. Add lines the way a Swedish death metal band cranks the distortion knob on an HM2. Extremity and maximalism are valid styles too. We always say that you shouldn't be too focused on drawing one thing. It's too easy to fall in love with one subject matter and draw it over and over until you're only good at drawing that thing. But the truth is, if you've done the work to be an accomplished generalist, it's okay to still have a favorite thing to draw. Something you can draw perfectly, every time, without reference, with a ton of style. And for Lydia, one of those things is motorcycles. And I don't really have anything to say other than I really enjoy watching her draw motorcycles, the way I enjoy watching a master chef prep a perfect meal. If I told you to draw a bird, how would you draw it? Maybe sitting on a branch, or from the side, wings flapping as it bursts into flight? But you might not think to draw a bird flying over you with its head facing downwards. Of course, we've all seen birds from this angle, but it takes a special kind of mindfulness to decide to draw one this way. And that's another subtle skill to develop as an artist. Drawing ordinary things in unexpected ways. It's all part of the training regimen that will eventually allow you to draw anything and everything. We recently said that good artists should be able to draw everything. But a lot of people, understandably, took this to mean that you have to open Wikipedia and draw every photo from every article alphabetically until you've practiced every object and animal on Earth. But what drawing everything really means is learning a select number of universal principles that you can apply to everything. Like how Lydia is drawing this old-school Bolex camera in the exact same way she'd draw a building. It's all perspective and geometry and foreshortening. And actually, who's to say that this isn't some skyscraper-sized camera monolith? Someone commented in a vaguely Australian accent, "Hey mate, yous should draw Bendy characters, that'd be cool." Well, we actually have done a lot of Bendy characters, especially the Roger Rabbit-inspired psycho chili man from our comic Interdimensional. But maybe this is a good chance to show how you can make other parts of your world bendy around the characters. Comics are such an expressive medium, our brains inherently accept this kind of distortion, and bending vehicles or environments to match bendy characters can unlock new dimensions of expression in your comics. So remember, Bad Ink says, if bro be bendy, better bend bro's backdrop, bruh. So many people ask us what our art style is or how to draw in this style, which always makes me feel like an alien, because for me and Lydia, this is just what comics and cartooning looked like growing up. This is what we worshipped as kids, reading Calvin and Hobbes and old Will Eisner comics. It's what modern artists like Daniel Warren Johnson or Chris Samnee do. It's classic cartooning with classic tools. brush and India ink on Bristol board, rendered by someone who has an innate understanding of anatomy and lighting, and yet has the confidence to simplify and exaggerate the characters into charming facsimiles. And it's utterly timeless and so difficult to master because it looks simple and it's so incredibly hard. Here's a great chance to talk about an amazing warm-up exercise, which I call the double sketch. A lot of us pick up ink, especially dip pen or brush, and we get nervous and super tight. But here, watch how Lydia starts in pencil, working very light and fast. This is an incredibly loose gestural sketch, just to find the form and get a sense of the composition. Then, keeping a sketch mindset, she switches to ink and works almost as if it were the second pass of pencils. You're tricking your brain here, training yourself to think of ink as a low-consequence medium. If you'd like, you can keep this mindset with ink wash or watercolor too. In the end, you're left with something more defined than a pencil sketch, but with all the energy and fun of a sketchbook piece. When we talk about liquid ink, everyone tells us how intimidating it is. That ink scares them because once you put down a line, you can't change it. Which of course is not necessarily true. Ink's permanence also makes it incredible at layering. Watch how Lydia changes her mind on the size and placement of the hand on the neck of the violin. She layers over it and then re-renders a new version, smaller and in a slightly different place. The ink is dark enough that it fully hides the old hand. In fact, if you wanted to be really philosophical, you could say that the very thing that makes ink so frightening is also its greatest strength.
Hey, it's Lydia, the mysterious voice behind the mysterious hands that draw all the inking content you've been seeing lately. Just wanted to close out our inking series by saying thank you. Everyone has been so ridiculously nice about my art over the last 30 videos. I made you guys this little fine line etching-inspired piece as an ender. It's amazing and a little weird to be lurking like a gremlin at my drawing table in my house in the woods, which does not look like this, by the way. It'd be cool, but it doesn't. And yeah, occasionally I send footage off to Evan, and suddenly something has a million views and thousands of comments. It's crazy. But like we always say, skill is just code for practice, and I promise that anyone can learn inking if you just enjoy the process and find things that you like to draw.